What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and today we are going to learn how to unlock the power of the daemon with emacsclient. Sorry for that ridiculous voice. So basically, Emacs has the capability of running in basically a server mode, and you can connect a client for Emacs to that daemon, or the daemon, to basically have a persistent session in Emacs that lives across different instances of frames that you open in Emacs. So this basically gives you a few different capabilities. Let me pull up my screen here. One of them, the sort of primary benefit that a lot of people like to enjoy from this is to pay the Emacs startup cost only once per boot. So since, whenever our Emacs configurations start to take on more packages and a lot of other things that we're loading up, it can take a while to load Emacs. So, you may take, 3 to 5 to 10 seconds, depending on what you're doing in your Emacs config. And if you want to not have to pay that cost every time you start up Emacs, running Emacs in daemon mode or daemon mode could be a good way to do that. However, there's other ways to improve the startup time of Emacs, and we can talk about that in another video. But for now, just assume that if you are unhappy with the Emacs startup time, you could do daemon mode as a way to deal with the startup cost. The other thing is that if you prefer to not have a single Emacs window or frame open all the time, you can have a session in the background that retains everything you've been doing so far, so that you can close the Emacs frames that you have open at any time and then reopen them and have all of the state that you had before. So it's kind of an interesting feature of Emacs that you don't see with other editors, where there's basically like, the memory of what's happening in Emacs is running in the background, and then you can have these transient frames or windows that you can close and reopen later. Also, one interesting feature of this, which we did exploit a little bit in the previous episode that we did on Polybar, is that you can use the emacsclient command to execute arbitrary Emacs list expressions in Emacs and either get the result back as a string or just to cause something to happen in Emacs. So if you wanted to automate some operation in Emacs, you could use emacsclient to cause a command to be run in your running Emacs session to do that. So it's a pretty powerful feature that we are going to show a little bit more about later in this episode. So first of all, let's talk about starting the daemon. So the easiest way to use the Emacs daemon is to use the built-in server start command. We did talk about this in the last episode, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the other way, which is using the Emacs -- daemon. But for those of you who didn't see that episode, I'll show you the documentation for server start. Basically what it is a command that can be run inside of Emacs that will turn the current Emacs process into a server or a daemon for any usages of emacsclient that you do in your system. So this is a very easy way to get started using Emacs as a daemon, because you can just use your normal Emacs configuration and run server start as part of your Emacs startup, and then you can use emacsclient outside of Emacs to then have things happen inside of your existing Emacs session. However, when you close the Emacs frame, or all of your Emacs frames that are a part of that session, the server will stop. So you don't have that benefit of it running in the background. And that's what the Emacs -- daemon parameter does whenever you run Emacs on the command line. So if you run Emacs -- daemon, what it does is it loads your Emacs configuration, and then it will run Emacs as a background process. So this -- daemon will automatically, like, whenever you run the command in the terminal, it will give you back your shell at the end, and then Emacs will be running in the background. So it forks off that process to run in the background. And then at that point, you can use the emacsclient command to interact with that daemon. However, you can also use the --fg daemon, which starts a foreground daemon, which allows you to see the output of Emacs as it's running, in case anything happens while you are running Emacs as a daemon, which can be helpful to debug issues that you have when running Emacs as a daemon. So that's something you can do if you need to experiment with something that isn't working quite correctly. Another interesting thing to note is that you can have independent daemons running at the same time. So if you like to have a lot of daemons around you, it's something you can do. So you can use the -- daemon equals and then the name that you want to assign to that particular daemon, so that you can have 2 or 3 daemons, however many you want. I mean, really, I would say probably the maximum that you would probably have in any real use would be 2, but probably just 1. But this allows you to do some things that we will talk about a little bit later, which, you can have different, basically, configurations of Emacs running at the same time, which could be useful to you. So let's try out what it means to use an Emx daemon. So I'm going to do this in the Ubuntu 20 VM that we've been using for some other things, so that we can see this outside of the context of my own setup and just sort of see how everything works independently. So first of all, let's just start up Emacs cold by itself, just to sort of get a sense for the startup time. Excuse me, and let's see how that looks. If I can get this to cooperate. All right, so I'm going to run Emacs. And you can see it loading. And I would say it's probably taking about 3 seconds for that to complete. Excuse me. So now that you've got a normal Emacs session here, so that's nothing really different than what we've been doing before. However, what we can do now is run Emacs -- daemon, or let's even do the FG daemon to show what I was talking about before. FG daemon. And now you'll see that we are loading Emacs in the console. You can see that we're getting the messages written out for loading all the various packages. And at the end, it says starting Emacs daemon. So what we'll do now is open up another terminal. And we are going to create a new Emacs frame using that daemon. And what you're going to see here is that the startup time will look a lot less because we're not loading our whole configuration because it's already loaded. So I'm just going to use the emacsclient -c command, which basically says create a new frame. When I do that, it pops up immediately. And we've got our whole Emacs configuration running here. So that's pretty nice. However, what you may notice is that there's something different. The fonts don't look right. And our Doom mode line also does not have the icons that we expect to see. We're going to talk about how to fix this problem in a little bit, but for now we're going to continue talking about how to use the daemon. So let's see, was there anything else I want to mention there? So like I mentioned before, you can create multiple daemons, and you can also figure out which daemons are currently running by looking at the socket. Let's see. Socket, wait, is server socket directory? Sorry for that. Control HV socket. Wow. Okay, let me double check this one more time real quick. I have it written down. Server socket dir. Is that a command or a variable? This is a variable. Should be a variable. Let's just look at this server socket dir. Okay, so for some reason the help function did not want to. Yeah, I must have typed something wrong. Anyway, so the server socket dir variable holds the path where server sockets are stored. And on Unix systems or Linux systems, whatever you want to call it, this would be a Unix socket that's created for the Emacs daemon session that then the client can connect to. And if you were to do an ls in this folder, like let's pull up eShell, and we type ls temp emacs 1000, you'll see that there is one socket file here called server. Now, if we were to start another Emacs daemon, so let's say Emacs daemon 2, it will load up another instance of Emacs as a daemon, so it's going to be called 2. And then we can look at that directory again, ls temp emacs 1000. And you can see that there's server and 2. So this tells you how you can communicate to both of these independently. They both have their own independent socket files, and you can find them easily on the system in case you wanted to see which daemons were currently active. All right. So one last thing that is kind of useful whenever using daemons is that you might want to stop one from running if you wanted to restart it. Like, say, for instance, if you need to change your configuration and you want the daemon to pick it up again, you can use the emacsclient -e command, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But just for now, I'll show you how that works. So emacsclient -e kill Emacs. So when I run that, it will kill the main server. So as you saw, I did not put a server name in that whenever I ran the Emacs client command. So it killed the current window that I had open because I told it to kill Emacs. Now, if we were to look at that temp Emacs 1000 directory again, we'll see that the 2 session is still open. So I could also kill that with Emacs client -e kill Emacs. Oh, and I also need to use the -s parameters, so -s2. So that tells you which server to talk to. So I'm going to use that, And if I look in the ls temp Emacs 1000 folder again, then that daemon is also closed. So that's just a way that you can deal with the daemons when they're running. So most times you won't need to kill a daemon. You will just need to you maybe reload your configuration manually inside of Emacs in one of the frames that you have open. But if you ever want to just get like a fresh start and make sure that your configuration is going to load correctly in the daemon the next time you start up your computer, this is a good way to do it. Just kill the Emacs daemon and then load it up again using the emacs -- daemon command as before. All right, so let's see what else we want to talk about here. So now let's talk about adjusting the configuration for use in the daemon. So we need to do some tweaks to the config to make sure that when your configuration gets loaded up in the daemon, that you won't have any trouble with fonts or with any other configuration that might be assuming that we're running Emacs in the normal Emacs mode, Emacs configuration mode. So one thing that I want to point out is that something that I used to do in the past to check which operating system I was currently running in for my Emacs config, like if you use the same Emacs config across multiple systems, you might want to know which OS you're running so you can turn on or turn off certain parts of your configuration. I was using the Windows system variable for this. So if you look at that variable, window-system, it will tell you that it's the name of the Windows system through which the selected frame is displayed. It will say X if it's an X Windows system window, like if you're in Linux, W32 for a Windows display, and also NS if you are in Mac OS. I highly recommend not using Windows system for this, especially if you are going to use Emacs in daemon mode, because it will return nil if you are loading Emacs in daemon mode. So if you have any config that is looking for that Windows system variable to be a specific value, you're going to have problems when you load your config. The better way to check for your OS is to use the system type variable. And if you look at it, it tells you a few different options here based on what possible OSs Emacs could run on. And you'll see I have this little pcase invocation here to check the values and to return a different string. So if I were to use Control-X, Control-E to evaluate this, it will tell me in the echo area that it's Linux. So system type is a better variable to use for checking your OS in case you need to do that in your config. Also, you might want to check if your config is being loaded in the daemon just to make sure that you maybe turn off some behavior or change how you load things based on whether the configuration is being loaded in the daemon. So there is the, excuse me, the daemon p function that will return true if the current Emacs process is a daemon process. So right now, this instance of Emacs that I'm using is not running as a daemon. And if I run this, the if statement will go to this branch at the bottom that says it's not running in daemon, and will tell me that I'm loading in the regular Emacs. However, if you were to run this in Emacs whenever it is running in a daemon, it will print out the loading in the daemon. The interesting thing about this daemon p function is that if you are using a named daemon, like if you give the daemon a name, this daemon p will actually return that name of the daemon that it is currently running. So if you wanted to use multiple daemons for different things, like you have your main daemon for your day-to-day Emacs use and you have a secondary daemon for something else, you can do checks in your configuration to see which daemon you're currently running the configuration in and change the behavior based on that. So that could be useful if you start to use a more complex Emacs config with daemons. Okay. So the other thing that we did see here already was configuring the UI for new frames. So one thing to keep in mind is that whenever you load up your Emacs configuration in the daemon, the faces that you set on certain things won't be active whenever you load up your first frame. So you load your configuration in the daemon, you're probably running things like set face attribute inside of your code to set the fonts you're using and the font sizes. But those things get overridden the first time that you load your frame. I'm not sure if that's something that because of the way that Emacs sets its frame parameters when it starts up, or if it's something where the faces just get ignored whenever you set them before you create a frame. But at any rate, you have to do something to make sure that you set the faces after you load that first frame. So we can set up a little bit of eLisp code to replace what we're already doing in this configuration we've been building on this channel to make this work correctly. So I'm going to copy this little bit of config, and then I'm going to roll over to our VM. And I will, let's see, we don't have a daemon running at the moment, so I'm going to start up a new one. And then we will, let's see, Emacs -- daemon. Let's do FG daemon. And then once that gets loaded completely, what I'll do is create a new window. All right, so now we're back to the state where we don't have the right fonts. So I'm going to load up the .emacs.d emacs.org file. Now, what I will mention is that for the faces that we've been setting for org mode so far, those do work somehow. I think that it must just be that there's some default configuration that gets applied to the normal, like, fixed pitch and variable pitch fonts that gets overwritten whenever you load up Emacs for the frame the first time. I don't know exactly what the reason is for that, but somehow the org fonts are working fine. However, the default fonts in Emacs are not working fine whenever we use daemon mode. So what we're going to do is drop down to this section where we set our faces, and I'm just going to paste in this new code and delete what we had there before, and I'll explain what it does. We're setting the faces exactly the same. We're wrapping it with a function. So now we're defining this function called efs/setFontFaces. And this function basically will just call setFaceAttribute for all the same faces that we were setting before, which is the default face, the fixed pitch face, and the variable pitch face. And I will go ahead and evaluate that. And now we have this little section below that checks that daemon p function that we used before. And if it's true, we add a hook to the afterMakeFrame functions hook. This variable holds a list of functions that need to be called after a frame is created. So what this means is whenever you load Emacs, your Emacs configuration to the daemon, we're going to set a hook so that the next time someone calls emacsclient to create a frame, this function, this EFS set font face is going to be executed. So I will go ahead and execute this. The other thing to realize here is that if daemon p returns nil, we will just call set font faces directly. So if you load your Emacs config just in a regular Emacs session, it will also work the same way. So what we're going to do now is, let's see, I haven't run that function yet, but I'm going to just run this little invocation right here so you can see that it works. If I use Control-X, Control-E, then you'll see that our fixed pitch fonts get loaded correctly, get set correctly. And if I were to go into, like, let's say the init.el file, you see that our font is Furon Mono like we expect it to be. So that does work after the frame is already created. Now what we'll do is we will close this frame and reopen it. And we will see that when we get back into it, the fonts are also set correctly. However, it's a little misleading because I think what happens here is that whenever we have run those set face attribute function calls, it does set the current daemon to remember them in memory. So it's not really configured, loading from configuration yet. It's actually just in memory. It knows what faces to use. So you launch a new frame. It's going to have the right fonts. What we really need to do to verify that this is working for us is we need to kill the daemon and restart it and make sure that the configuration is working. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to, since this daemon's running in the foreground, I can just use Control-C to kill it. And then I'll start it up one more time. And now we'll see that the configuration loads. And then if I run the Emacs client one more time, we'll see that the fonts are loaded correctly this time when we load it up. And if we go look at the messages buffer, we'll see this setting faces, which is something that was writing out there. So we can look at the emacs.org and search for setting faces. And yeah, so now we can see that that function actually did run, but only after we loaded that frame. So now we see that this is configuring the frame whenever it starts up. So the other thing that we had a problem with was that the Doom mode line icons were not loading. And the thing you can do for that is to also set this Doom mode line icon variable to true whenever you load your frame. The reason why this works is because Doom mode line by default is looking to see if you're running in daemon mode whenever it sets the default value of this variable, and it will set it to nil if it sees you running in daemon mode or in terminal mode. So you need to basically force it to true so that it works. And as soon as I run that, I don't know if you just noticed that, but I just ran this code for setq Doom mode line icon t. As soon as I ran it, the icon showed up in the mode line. So if I were to close this frame and reopen it, if it decides to work, I think it just completely locked up. There we go. All right, so I'll open the frame again, and now you can see that the icons are still there, and that's because we still have that persistent Emacs session that is causing that to be remembered. So if I close the frame again, I go and I kill the daemon, and then I load it back up again, wait for it to give me the message that it started. then I will go back and start up the client one more time, and then we can see that the icons are loaded correctly. So now we've got a configuration that loads in the daemon, but when this frame gets loaded, the fonts and the mode line icons all get loaded correctly. So the thing to remember there is that anything that doesn't work correctly in your configuration whenever you load it up in daemon mode, or whenever you start as a daemon and then you create a frame, if you see anything that doesn't work correctly, you may need to use this after, what's it called? The after make frame functions to run some code after the frame gets loaded. Now, it's worth noting that I think this function, this hook, gets run every single time that a frame gets created. Let's see, yeah, functions run after make frame creates a new frame. So if you don't want this code to run every time, then if you use Emacs 27, you can use the server after make frame hook, which only runs the first time that a frame is created for that server. That would do some initial configuration to set everything up, all your faces and everything, and then it won't run again if you create another frame. So that's something to keep in mind, but I don't think there's really any problem with running this function every time your frame starts up. I mean, it's really just a matter of taste in the end. So another couple variables that can be useful for this are the initial frame A list and the default frame A list. And these are basically key value pairs for frame variables that get set either in the case of the initial frame A list the first time a frame is created for the server, and then the default frame A list sets things that are created or that are set every time a frame is created. So if you have any UI elements that do not display correctly whenever you load up your frame after loading the daemon, you should probably set initial frame A list or default frame A list to fix that. So if I were to look at the default frame A list variable right now with Control H, Control V, I think I just hit the wrong one. Let's do that one more time. Control H, Control V, default frame A list. You can see that this is what the current value looks like. Some of these things are coming from things that I've set in the configuration before now, so they may already be set correctly, but if there's anything else that you know of that you need to set, this is a good place to put it. So you just need to basically put the name of the value and then the value of the value in this A list. So if you want to learn more about frame parameters, definitely go check out the manual at this link, because it will tell you more about what frame parameters are available and how you might set those. Okay, we already talked about fixing the do mode line icons, so we can move on to the next bit. I think I was about to start writing notes about sort of general tips, but that was basically what I told you before. Like, if there's anything that isn't working quite right, then go set those things in a hook or in one of these frame A list variables so that it gets set whenever your first frame actually loads correctly. So let's talk about using Emacs client, because that's sort of the whole point of using Emacs as a daemon, is that you have this Emacs session running in the background, and then you can use Emacs client to cause it to do things. So there are a few different arguments that are important to know about. We have already seen the -c argument, which creates a frame. However, what you might not have noticed is that every time we use Emacs client -c, it tells us it's waiting for Emacs, and it will block your shell until you close that frame. So as soon as I close the frame, it will release control back to the shell so you can type another command. So there's another parameter that you want to use in this case, which is the -n parameter, which says don't wait. So don't wait for Emacs client to come back before letting the shell continue. So if I wanted to use that, I could use Emacs client -c -n, and then now whenever I start the frame, the shell is given back to me and I can type further commands there. So this is probably going to be important if you're using this as part of a script or something else, so that you don't block the script waiting for this to come back. However, it is useful sometimes to block the shell and wait for the Emacs client to be closed. There's another way that you can use the Emacs client. If you've ever heard of the environment variable called editor, this is a variable that's used whenever any program needs to launch a text editor for you to edit something and then save it so that it can be used in something else. So for instance, if you do a git commit on the command line, setting the editor environment variable will call into your editor of choice, and you need to make sure you pass it the right parameter so that it does not give control back to the calling program until you're finished editing that file. So if I were to show you an example of this, let me just copy it real quick. So let's copy this little bit of code here, and I'll show you. So I'm going to run this little bit, which basically sets the editor environment variable to Emacs client -c -a Emacs. I'll talk about -a in a minute, but for now, we're noticing that we're not using -n here. We're just using -c. And if I were to go into my .emacs.d and add init.l as a file to be staged and type git commit, then what it's going to do is going to open up an Emacs frame to allow me to edit the commit message for that file. And then I can write whatever I want, and then I can close the frame to go back to git commit and have it actually finish that commit, basically. So I can just say, here is the commit message. And I'll save this file here. And to get back out of this, you need to use the Control-X hash sign, I guess. I don't really know exactly what to call that character, hash mark. And then that tells the client to exit and then return control back to the program that called it. And as you can see here, we've made a commit called here's the commit message. So we have been able to use Emacs to edit our commit message and then go back to the shell, basically. Now, I don't necessarily recommend you do it this way. I would rather you just use magit or maggot, however you want to call it. But this is an option if you wanted to use Emacs client for that purpose. So going back to the parameters, so we did see -e, which is for eval, which allows you to evaluate arbitrary Emacs Lisp expressions at the shell and get the value back out. So let's say we want to see what the current buffer name is that we're editing in our frame. Wow, okay, that popped up out of nowhere. So let's edit a file. Let's say .emacs.d, emacs.org, and I'm going to go into the shell here. I'll paste this command. So it says Emacs client-e buffer name. Okay, I think that buffer name is not going to work correctly in this case because it's getting the server buffer. But you can get anything else. Let's see, Emacs client-e. You can get the value of variables. So let's look for that server socket dir that we were talking about before. And I can get the value for that variable back on the command line. So if you wanted to be able to extract information from Emacs in a script that you're writing or for some other purpose, like integrating it with another program, we showed this with the integration with Polybar in the last episode, then you can use this to get that value out and then use it somehow. You can also invoke functions and commands, basically, to do whatever you want. So if you want to automate Emacs somehow. So let's say I wanted to run console switch buffer. So when I run that, what it's going to do is cause console switch buffer to show up or to activate inside of my current selected frame, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if you'd want to do that particular task, but it does show you that you can run arbitrary commands inside of your... let's see if I can get back out of this now. Anyway, you can run arbitrary commands in the running Emacs session using that. So there may be some powerful things that you can do with that. So the problem I have with this VM configuration running the default desktop environment is I keep hitting super 1, 2, 3 out of habit, and it just opens up random programs, which is a lot of fun. So what else do we have here? Also, let's see. You can use the -u parameter to... Let me go back up here to my list, if I can find it again. There we go. To suppress output. So let's say you're running Emacs client as part of a script and you don't want to see the output in the script. You can use the -u parameter to suppress the output so you don't see any output coming out. You'll still be able to see the exit code of the Emacs client, which will give you 0 if it succeeded and 1 if it failed somehow. And then S is socket name, which is useful whenever you have named your daemon something. So if you use Emacs --daemon equals foo, then you would also use Emacs client -s foo to invoke whatever you're doing inside of that daemon with that particular name. So if you use multiple daemons, this is a parameter you're going to use a lot. And another one is the -a parameter, which is kind of interesting because if a daemon is not running, then you can give it an alternate command to run instead. And that's what we saw before in this editor variable that I had set up, where we say editor equals Emacs client -c -a Emacs. So basically, if Emacs client finds that there's no daemon running, no default daemon running, it is going to run Emacs instead. So you can use basically any command there. You can say whatever you want. In fact, I use this whenever I'm doing some automation of my own dot file management with Emacs, and I'll show you that right now. So I run Emacs client to suppress output and to evaluate the org save all org buffers function, basically so that I cause my Emacs session to save all my org files at that moment. And then if Emacs Daemon is not running, I just echo instead saying that Emacs is not currently running. So I'll show you the context of this script so you see what I'm talking about. So basically this is a script where I sync my .files from my .files repo and then basically regenerate all of my .files from my org mode files. And part of that is like, I want to stash my current state of all my config, but I need to save all my org files first to make sure that all of the output files are up to date before I stash them, because otherwise things will get into a big mess. So I run it here basically to save all of my org buffers if Emacs is running, and that can just be a part of a script basically. So let's hop back over to the original file. If you want to look at that file, I've got a link to the web here in the show notes that you can take a look at. So let's see, the last thing would just be, one pretty primary way to use Emacs Client is just if you wanted to cause it to open a file for editing from the command line. So if you're in a terminal already and you want Emacs to open a file to be edited, you can just use Emacs Client. And then we can say .emacs, let's see, oh, we're already here. So I'll just say desktop.org. And it will open up that file in whatever frame is currently active. And also, since we didn't use -n, then it's waiting for Emacs to come back. If I Control-C here, it actually closes that buffer, which is kind of funny. But I will do -n now so that it doesn't wait. And then basically anytime you want to edit a file, you could do that easily. You might want to set an alias in Bash or Z shell, whatever you use as your terminal or as your shell, to make that more easy. Like you could set up like an edit command, and then that would call Emacs Client to open that file. You can also obviously create a new frame to edit that file if you wanted with -c, and then you have a new frame. So I think that's basically it for what we want to talk about for the Emacs Client parameters and their arguments. So one last thing that's kind of interesting is that if you want to use a secondary daemon, you could offload some of the heavier tasks that you have to do to this daemon. Like for instance, in my config, I tangle my org configuration files every time I save them. And because I'm doing it inside of the same Emacs process, this can take a little bit. Like for instance, let's go to my emacs.org file. I'm just gonna change something and save real quick. And you'll notice that it takes a little bit of time before it tangles them out. Right now it's not tangling for some reason, but it does take maybe like 1, 2, 3 seconds sometimes. And that is a little bit annoying, especially if you have super save mode turned on and it automatically saves your buffers every time you switch focus. This can cause Emacs to hang somewhat. So one thing you could do is to have a secondary daemon loaded, which all it does is just take requests to tangle out that file, and then it gets done in the background. However, I don't really recommend using daemons for this approach. I know I keep saying daemon and daemon. Don't ask. I wouldn't recommend using daemons for this approach just because it's kind of overhead. There is a package you could use called Emacs Async that is probably easier to use for this purpose. So if you want to do some kind of background processing like this, maybe this async package is better for your purposes. However, the secondary daemon is a possibility for this if you want to. So last thing I want to mention is that Emacs in most Linux distributions will come with a systemd unit file. So if you're not allergic to systemd, if you're okay using systemd, then you could set up your Emacs daemon just by using system control, and you can set it up as a user level service so that it gets launched when you log in. Just note that whenever you run the daemon when you log in, it might make your login time take a bit longer as it's loading your whole configuration in Emacs at that time. But after that, anytime you load the Emacs client to create a frame, it will be very fast. So that's something that might be a benefit to you if you do want to go with that preloading approach for your configuration. And also, if you don't want to use systemd, you could just set a call to Emacs-s daemon inside of your .profile file or your startup commands for your desktop environment, or however you automatically launch programs whenever you log into your computer. You can set it up there. So that is something that is an option if you do not want to use systemd and you're on Linux. For Windows and Mac OS, you would just use whatever they use for setting startup programs. So in Windows, I think there's like somewhere in the UI you can configure that, and then in Mac OS, there's probably something you can use in the UI, or you could use the bash profile or some other file like that to set that up. All right. Oh, and the nice thing that I just noticed is that my face video has been frozen. I have no idea how long that's been. So I hope you enjoyed looking at my face looking like this the whole time. So anyway, the last thing I want to mention is just to thank my sponsors. I think I haven't updated the screen since the last couple sponsors came on board. We are now up to 30 sponsors on, for the channel, so I really appreciate all the people who have signed up to be GitHub sponsors. Your support means the world to me. And if any of you watching now would like to support the content that I'm making on this channel, please feel free to check out github.com/sponsors/DavidWill to learn more about how you can become a sponsor for the content that I'm making here. I think I'll do one more video this week, and I'll probably won't have one on Friday. We'll see whether I do or not, but we'll definitely see you on Wednesday with another video in probably the Emacs Tips series. So until then, thanks a lot and happy hacking. See you next time.